Hello and happy solstice to you and YouTube. It's jolly old Lee Basil here, interrupting our regular channel content to indulge myself in a little holiday treat. Today, I plumb the depths of my 2022 media experiences and resurface with only the finest, the most resplendent gems to share with you all. I'm gonna tell you about some stuff I liked this year. First games, then movies, then of course anime, and finally some miscellaneous offerings, like TV shows, maybe even a book. Will I prove my literacy by the end of this video? Watch on to find out. I played a lot of new games this year, a lot by my standards, which is like more than 2. Here's a bunch of games that I really loved in 2022. First, Perfect Tides. If you haven't heard of this one, it's a point-and-click adventure game by Meredith Grand, one of my all-time favorite cartoonists. Her webcomic, Octopus Pie, which ended in 2017, is one of the canonical texts of my life. I go back to Grand's writing constantly. It's so rich with insight. In Perfect Tides, Grand tackles adolescence and coming of age. The game is about Mara, a 15-year-old girl in the year 2000. Though Mara lives in a beautiful island paradise, she's awkward, a bit cynical, and spends her days writing fanfic on an early forum community. She's just like you and me. Set over 4 distinct seasons and stretching the course of a year, Perfect Tides confronts Mara and the player with online boyfriends, strained friendships, looming traumas, some familial dysfunction, and the intense pursuit of the perfect Hanukkah gift for your mom. This game is really something special. I'm not a big point-and-click fan, but it's emotional and enthralling and very funny, and it made me cry. It has one of my favorite genres of protagonist, the teenage hero whose perpetual awkwardness and insensitivity makes me shrivel up in mortified recognition, but who I never stop rooting for. And there's so much going on with the side characters. I spent days after the end credits thinking about Lily and Jason and Simon, who are all in their own ways people I've known, people I've struggled to understand in the same way Mara does. If any of this sounds appealing to you, Perfect Tides is available on Steam, and I really recommend it. As a bonus, a sequel to Perfect Tides has already been funded on Kickstarter, so even when you finish, you'll have more game to look forward to. Hot take, Elden Ring rules? I'm gonna keep this section short as more qualified gamers have sung its praises more articulately than I could ever manage. I'm gonna talk about my personal experiences with this game. Elden Ring was my first From Software game, though I've long admired the deep lore and the challenging gameplay from afar. I was honestly pretty intimidated. I've never been great at action games, even the ones I enjoy, but Elden Ring came out and I gave it a shot. And wow, I'm glad I did. What I discovered is that From Software games have such a different approach to action than I'm used to. It's less a flurry of oncoming enemies and more like a slow dance. Elden Ring trained all the button mash out of me. You feel the weight of your character's every action and you learn to deploy them carefully. And yes, the combat is hard. I probably died to Godric the Grafted, no joke, about 300 times, but once I pulled it off, I felt incredible. I beat the game, even Millennia. So moral of the story, if you want to play Elden Ring but you're not sure you're good enough, just go for it. It might take a lot of time, but God is it rewarding. In a lot of ways, honestly. Be glad I spent this section talking about gameplay and not the deep Moog Lord of Blood lore. Tunic is an isometric action-adventure game that is 1 part Zelda, 1 part Dark Souls, and 1 part obscure foreign game you find at a yard sale and struggle to decipher without a manual or walkthrough. This game is deeply mysterious, but that's all by design. You run around as a cute little fox fighting enemies, uncovering secrets, and gleaning narrow insights about the plot and mechanics in an incredibly tightly designed experience. Tunic is designed to deliver moments that make you smack your head and go, oh my god, that's what I was supposed to do this whole time? I adored my time with Tunic. I've never experienced anything quite like it. It's challenging, satisfying, pretty confusing, but it never feels too oblique. You learn the game's quirks as you go, and as you progress, you find pages of an in-game manual that are sometimes even useful. If you like solving puzzles with minimal context, and genuinely good puzzles, stuff you can usually infer without a walkthrough given enough trial and error, you'll probably like Tunic. While we're at it, I want to add that I loved the combat in this game. It's the biggest complaint I've seen about Tunic. Fun game, but the bosses are too hard. I couldn't disagree more. Granted, I did come to Tunic immediately after finishing Elden Ring, so I was already primed to enjoy a boss fight that you can throw yourself at for 40 plus minutes. There's an invincibility mode you can enable if you don't want to deal with that, by the way. But I loved almost every single one. They're like really good Zelda bosses, all a matter of recognizing patterns and timing your counterattacks, just a little more unforgiving than what you'll find in an average Nintendo game. If you want to play Tunic, I believe it's now available on all platforms, including the Switch. Support a cool indie dev. They put some stuff in this game specifically for speedrunners, which is always the sign of a cool developer. Let me tell you a story. A story of a game franchise initially imagined as a spin-off to Harvest Moon. And yes, I'm doing a whole thing here, sorry, you'll have to bear with me. A spin-off to Harvest Moon. It took the core mechanics of farming, mining, raising animals, and marrying cute girls, but pushed the format into new territory. What if we added action RPG combat, crafting, and a fully fledged storyline set in this new fantasy world? The franchise was called Rune Factory, and after some promising but shaky initial entries, it really hit its stride in 2009's Rune Factory 3, which is still one of my all-time favorite games. This series found even broader success with its next entry, Rune Factory 4, the first game in the series to include a female protagonist and a selection of male love interests. But in 2013, fans of the series were crushed by the news that Rune Factory's developer, Neverland, was filing for bankruptcy. The future of the franchise was initially uncertain, but as years passed, we all reluctantly accepted the writing on the walls. Our beloved Rune Factory was dead, never to return. Until a very special Nintendo Direct in February 2019. It lived. I actually watched this Direct at work and cried in front of God and my coworkers and everyone. In my humble opinion, if you like farming sims, Rune Factory is as good as it gets. No, it does not have the mechanical depth of Stardew or the polish of Harvest Moon / Story of Seasons, but it has something neither of those series have. Cute elves and dwarves and stuff, and ojo-samas, men with animal ears. These gorgeously designed characters have some occasional depth. Sometimes they're even relevant to the story, which exists and is pretty good. It's also the type of game with 24 things to do and complete freedom to choose where you'll go next. The various fishing, crafting, smithing, brewing, and cooking systems are pretty dense and endlessly satisfying. You get experience for walking in this game. You can level up walking. The dopamine rewards are endless. Rune Factory 5 itself, while a pretty clunky transition to 3D and a somewhat short entry in the series, is nonetheless a very promising return. If you're a fan of farming sims, especially if you're a Stardew fan who hasn't branched out into the genre's other offerings, I totally recommend it. It's on both Switch and PC, and from what I've heard, the PC version has much smoother performance, so if that's a concern, maybe opt for that version. Rune Factory 4 Special is also on Switch and would be many people's first recommendation as a series entry point. Pick whichever one is more appealing to you. And as a parting note, yes, in Rune Factory 5, you can be gay. Thank God and the localization team who fought for this, because it rules. Before I get to my favorite game of the year, here's a couple games I really loved and have relatively less to say about. Dorfromantik is a German indie puzzle game. If you've ever thought, I like the idea of city builders, but I wish they were 100 times simpler and more vibes-based, this is the game for you. You get these little tiles, you put them together, trying to match up the edges. That's pretty much it. And it's perfect. Dorfromantik is available on Windows and Switch. I purchased it on both, and personally, I think it's a perfect Switch game. Both major Pokemon releases this year have been so exciting and fun. You know, opinions about Pokemon are like buttholes. Everyone has one, except for me, and you'll never prove otherwise. The games are real fun though, and somehow the characters just keep getting gayer. And finally, I got sucked back into Genshin Impact this year after Nahida and Layla caught my eye. Can you blame me? Look, I play a ton of gacha games, and I can never fully recommend them without a lot of caveats, but Genshin continues to be, admittedly, extremely fun. And finally, my favorite game of the year. Let's establish this first. I love tactical RPGs. I love a Fire Emblem. I own a $100 figure of the protagonist of Final Fantasy Tactics. So when Square Enix's new tactical RPG, Triangle Strategy, was released early this year, I bought it on release day. To summarize briefly, Triangle Strategy centers on the political tensions between three kingdoms which occupy the same continent of a medieval fantasy world. Many of you will hear this and make an immediate connection to Fire Emblem Three Houses, but the similarities basically stop there. Triangle Strategy follows a single protagonist, Serenoa of House Wolfort, a high-ranking noble in the Kingdom of Glenbrook, and you spend the game aligned with his home kingdom. Serenoa aims to keep the fragile peace between the three nations. He's even gotten engaged to Frederica of the Duchy of Esfrost, whose pink hair is a symbol of her oppressed bloodline. Just roll with it. But this hope for peace is quickly dashed when conflicting interests escalate into all-out war. Pretty standard fantasy RPG stuff. It takes a while to find the charm and the fun in Triangle Strategy, and frankly, it's quite easy to fall off before you get there. The game has enormous cutscenes, especially in the first 10 hours. There's an extraordinary amount of setup. My biggest piece of advice, it's all fully voiced, so just dock your Switch, crank up the volume, and listen to it like an audiobook until the story gets its hooks in you. You also won't necessarily be hooked on the characters right away. They have their charms, but they can feel a bit dry if you go in expecting like a Moe Fest Fire Emblem cast. Until they grew on me, all I had to hang on to was how hot Anna and Huette are. Even mechanically, I almost fell off Triangle Strategy before giving it a chance. There is virtually no character customization to be found in this game. The characters level up and learn new skills, but you can't like take your rogue and reclass her as a knight, or take her a few pegs down the magic skill tree, nothing like that. And that's kind of my favorite part of most RPGs, so I was wondering where I'd find the fun. I am so glad I stuck with Triangle Strategy though, it gets incredibly fun. In terms of story, your progress through the branching routes of Triangle Strategy is driven by a truly unique choice mechanic. In each chapter of the game, you'll be asked to make a decision with major political or tactical consequences, but you will not make these decisions alone. Each time the game enters this democracy simulator where you chat with the core members of your party and get their perspectives before taking it to a vote. Their ideas won't always align with yours, so to sway them to your side, you have to figure out how to convince them. And if you're personally not sure what to pick, they can make very compelling points. The first time I reached a branch in this game where I truly wasn't sure how to proceed, my sense of practicality standing in conflict with my ideals, I just sat there for an hour thinking about it. I'm not a huge fan of political fantasy stories, and mulling over the complex conflicts between entities who don't even exist is not generally my idea of a fun time. But Triangle Strategy made me a believer. The stakes feel so potent, and being put in charge of these genuinely challenging decisions is deeply engaging. When I felt strongly about the path I was choosing, especially knowing that some members of my party disagreed, I got extremely passionate and very, very annoying on Twitter about it. And over time, I also figured out that the gameplay is enormously fun. Foregoing a more flexible class system was absolutely necessary to the greatest strength of this game, its deep and diverse party of characters. In many ways, Triangle Strategy has less in common with your average JRPG and more in common with a tabletop RPG. Your party is not just a collection of different kinds of DPS with a couple support characters thrown in. You get DPS, support, utility, tanks. Characters whose entire function is crowd control and who do it so well. I'm looking at you, Piccoletta, you beautiful little clown. Actually, Anna totally plays like a D&D rogue, with 2 actions per turn and everything. Everyone's kits start out very simple and straightforward, and as you level them, they gain access to more and more skills without losing anything they've already learned, so there ends up being myriad ways to play each character or to strategize on any given map. You can beat this game, open up a New Game Plus file, and do it again with completely different party compositions and get a totally different experience of each map. If you're into this type of game at all, I cannot emphasize enough how fun this is. There's one small personal complaint about this game I want to tack on to the end. Without giving away any spoilers, Triangle Strategy has 3 main endings as well as a bonus golden route if you make very particular choices. It's like the ideal ending in contrast to 3 more challenging options. In my opinion, Triangle Strategy didn't need the golden route. Those 3 imperfect endings perfectly embody the strength of the political writing in this game. The 3-sided war is not some slapdash effort to draw conflict out of the story or elevate the stakes. Triangle Strategy has a lot to say about governments, about power, about duty. You'd be forgiven for initially assuming that the protagonist's home nation of Glenbrook is like the good monarchy in contrast to the ruthless empire or the religious zealotry represented by the other kingdoms. But it's much more complicated than that, and the game goes out of its way to demonstrate that the hopes and ideals on which these kingdoms wage their wars don't always resonate with the common folk. What's more, choosing my final route at the end was not actually a difficult choice at all to me. The ending I chose came with grief and with sacrifice and with broken promises, as all three of the main endings do, but I really believed in what it represented, and I still do. So I don't want a true ending that tells me I could have had it all if I'd just followed a walkthrough. It cheapens the core of an extremely powerful game. Triangle Strategy is available on Nintendo Switch and on Windows, and I cannot recommend it enough. I saw a lot of movies this year. Like, a lot of movies. I work remotely, so I don't get out of the house much, which was really taking its toll on my mental fortitude, so around June, I treated myself to a membership to my local chain of movie theaters, and I forced myself out of the house every weekend to see a new movie, and man, biggest game changer of my year. Like, oh my god, guys. Movies are so cool, and going to the movies by yourself is the most underrated activity. Plus, the movie theaters in my city sell alcohol. I don't even have to sneak it in. Anyway, here are my favorite movies of 2022. Okay, you knew this one was going to be here. You saw there was a section for movies, and you were like, let's see what this queer has to say about everything everywhere. And frankly, I don't even have that much to say about it. I've yet to articulate a coherent thought about this film, and I'm kind of afraid to try. It just made me cry so hard. It shot all my vulnerabilities with a laser beam for 2 hours, and I cried harder than I've ever cried at a movie. Everyone should see it. Has everybody seen it? If you haven't, it's time to watch it. I compel you. Okay, here's one I can talk about in more depth. I have some unpopular opinions. Men is a British horror film directed by Alex Garland, known for Ex Machina and Annihilation. The protagonist, a recently widowed woman, spends a holiday in the countryside, hoping to heal from fresh tragedies, but finds herself plagued by terrible men and increasingly surreal occurrences. Men follows a pretty ideal horror movie formula. It starts with something grounded, a harrowing experience that stretches relatability but is by all means realistic. Something you can imagine going through even if it feels warped and unreal in its cruelty. From there, it spends a while being slow and quiet and contemplative as the world grows increasingly weirder, more hostile, and more chaotic. It's filled with striking, often grotesque imagery, but it's frankly beautiful from start to finish in spite of that. I found this movie haunting and totally enthralling. Also, I don't tend to judge horror movies on whether they're scary. I sadly lack the fright gene for fictional stories, but even by my standards, Men is pretty scary. I mean, what's more frightening than weird men outside your house trying to get into your house? That's just my constant background anxiety. Admittedly, Men is not a terribly popular movie, and it's a bit of a punching bag among the kinds of people who post religiously on Letterboxd. Follow me on Letterboxd, by the way. And look, is it a heavy-handed film? Sure, absolutely. Does it use obvious crucifixion imagery and Garden of Eden metaphors? Yeah, and in a worse movie, I might be critical of that. But does that heavy-handedness work to shallow or manipulative ends? No, I don't think so. I think Men presents a complex and layered story with a wealth of emotional subtext to dig into, and if you're open to it, it hits pretty hard. Frankly, I don't accept the criticism of people who act like it's a generic men bad movie, like some cloying work of pop feminist media. It's a film about being psychologically destroyed by one man, by one specific abusive experience, and having that trauma reflected back at you through a culture at large. And for my money, the feelings it taps into are brutally real. It's a good movie. I would recommend it, but not if you're squeamish. Tar is a drama about a fictional composer, Lydia Tarr, who is considered one of the living legends in her field. It follows this globally acclaimed musical genius in the weeks leading up to a career-defining performance as secrets come to light and her reputation spirals out of control. Clocking in at about 2.5 hours, Tar is a slow film, heavy on dialogue and devoid of a soundtrack outside of diegetic instances of music performance. It's a story heavy on realism, a series of meandering conversations strung together that only take on broader significance as the conflict carefully takes form. In other words, it's very boring, beautifully, wonderfully boring, the kind of boring I love to sink my teeth into. An engrossing script, stunning cinematography, sound design that just envelops you in the moment, and these long scenes that sweep you along and spit you out just feeling different. There's this massage parlor scene that gives me goosebumps. I walked out of this movie thinking that was pretty good, and then spent the next several days obsessively unfurling it in my mind. Be warned, Tar is a movie that resists simple moralistic interpretation. In the first half hour of the film, there's what I could only describe as an anti-SJW rant that I've already seen clipped out of context on social media and launched as a political football. A middle-aged man actually started clapping during that scene during my screening, but I would strongly discourage audibly showing approval for any monologue the protagonist makes during the first act of a drama. It's probably not going to end well for you. Anyway, if you enjoy slow burn movies, settle in for an evening with Tar. I really loved it. Before we talk about my favorite movie of the year, here are a few others I enjoyed because, oh god, did I watch a ton of them. Barbarian is an absolute blast of a horror movie that only got better on the rewatch. It's the perfect balance of dumb fun expressed through an impressively well-crafted piece of cinema. Bodies, Bodies, Bodies made me question whether movies are getting better at making fun of young people or if maybe I'm just getting old. Great movie, lots of fun, extremely quotable. While we're on our horror movie streak, Piggy is a Spanish film that I really enjoyed. An overweight teenager is abused by her peers until they get got by a serial killer, and she is torn between helping the police or the murderer who saved her. If this premise sets off the potential fat phobia alarms in your head, as it certainly did for me, I'll say that this movie is nothing but empathetic and vindicating toward its protagonist. Though if you're triggered by depictions of fat phobia, it does get quite heavy in that respect. Unironically though, this is the romance movie of the year for me. Nope was great. I just want Jordan Peele to keep making whatever movies he wants to make forever. The man's a visionary. Goodbye Don Glees was a very sweet coming-of-age anime film. I watched this on edibles and in my impaired state, fully interpreted the entire thing as a gay love triangle where the protagonist falls madly in love with Ayumu Murase's character. And that's how I recommend watching it, but sober is fine too. Sober is still fun, I think. And also, by the way, I liked Bros. I think it got an unfair shake. It was good, made me cry a little, and more people should watch it. And my favorite movie of the year, Inu-Oh. If you haven't heard of this one, you're in for a treat. Inu-Oh is the latest film from legendary anime director Masaaki Yuasa. You may be familiar with Yuasa from acclaimed series like Devilman Crybaby or Keep Your Hands Off Eizouken, or if you're like me, maybe your brain chemistry was permanently altered by 2008's Kaiba. Yuasa's work is poignant and offbeat, but his trademark might be this fluid animation style that's always recognizable despite its stylistic diversity. To be honest, Yuasa is pretty hit or miss for me. By design, his style can be ugly, jarring, abrasive, and if a work doesn't resonate with me emotionally, I tend to bounce off fairly quickly. But I grabbed last-minute tickets to Inu-Oh knowing nothing about it, having seen a poster and Yuasa's name, ready to roll the dice on my least most favorite director. Inu-Oh, I was delighted to find, is a rock opera set in feudal Japan. Inu-Oh is a story about a blind boy who befriends a hideous monster with a beautiful voice. Inu-Oh is about androgynous rock stars growing out their hair and taking over culture through counterculture. Inu-Oh is about the power of a name, of the names we choose, and the countless names that are lost to time. Inu-Oh's title character is voiced by a mixed-race, non-binary Japanese vocalist, and the soundtrack is the best of the year, bar none, featuring one culminating track that made it onto my Spotify Wrapped. Inu-Oh is about differences being embraced, subsumed, and then obliterated by those in power. Inu-Oh is a timeless, heart-wrenching bromance. Inu-Oh is, in every literal and thematic sense, a rock opera, set in feudal Japan. Sometimes the more I like a movie, the less I have to say about it. Please watch Inu-Oh. It's coming to streaming in late December, so I hope to God you can watch it by the time this video comes out. And please enjoy. I loved it. Okay, cinema is out the door. We're done talking about cinema. It's time for the real serious art. Let's talk about 2022 anime. I didn't have a standout favorite this year, so these are in no particular order. I'd be remiss to not talk about Chainsaw Man. Despite my friends loving this manga, I avoided it until the anime came out, as I have a track record of being pretty unenthused about the big shonen series of the moment. I don't dislike shonen anime. When I love it, good God do I love it, but it's not one of the tropey genres that always hits for me. So here's a PSA to all my loved ones. If an anime has a hot, evil woman who wants to make the protagonist her dog, just lead with that. Tell me that, and then I will know to watch it. In all seriousness, Chainsaw Man is a revelation. I watched the first couple episodes, immediately caught up on the manga, and now I am a Chainsaw believer. If somehow you've missed the bus on Chainsaw Man and need a simple pitch, it subverts the shonen trope of the earnest young protagonist chasing his lofty dreams. The main character has lived for so long in crushing poverty that he spends much of the story learning how to dream, what to dream, why to dream, once the better life you've longed for is suddenly possible. In other words, it's a story about a man whose head and arms turn into chainsaws who really wants to touch boobs. I knew going in that Chainsaw Man was dumb, silly fun, and it most certainly is, but I didn't realize how genuine the character writing would be. And I don't mean it's better than expected. I mean, there are some character dynamics here I've never seen depicted before in anime, especially between male and female characters. Plus, it blends these two contrasting tones of harrowing, harsh reality and heartfelt, affectionate earnesty in a way that makes both ends of the spectrum feel so sincere and so scary. The story can take such positive or such negative turns at any moment. It's exhilarating to watch or read. Also, it has Makima, Momsplain Manipulate My Life. Okay, let's see what else is on this list. Remember how I said shonen is not one of the tropey genres that always hits for me? This idol anime is the tropey genre that does almost always hit for me. I can watch cookie-cutter characters follow plot formulas to the letter, but I will eat it up, and when those kiddos sing, I'm all in. I genuinely adore Love Live, and for my money, 2022 gave us the greatest season of Love Live ever made, Superstar Season 2. If it's been a second since you watched Superstar Season 1, don't worry, I'll catch you up to speed. Our protagonists, the 5 members of the school idol group Liella, have now advanced into being second years. Superstar Season 2 will follow Liella as 4 new first years join the group, and as our heroes aim to finally become the Love Live champions. There's also a new rival this season who has a chip on her shoulder, a fixation on our protagonist, and a style that I could only describe as if Valkyrie from On Stars were a middle school girl. You may ask, so what does this season of Love Live do better than all the others? And my answer is, it just doesn't do the things that make the other seasons kind of a drag. Like, the quirky comic relief characters who are always throwing around their catchphrases. What if we just wrote them a little better and let them integrate with the group a little bit more seamlessly? The age-old conflict where one member of the group might decide to study abroad? What if you actually cared about it and made it resonate with her broader character arc? Love Live has always excelled in the fun, slice-of-lifey bits, but the other parts, the weirdly heavy-handed melodrama that always brings the story to a grinding halt, it rarely works, and at the worst, it's pretty painful to sit through. But I gotta hand it to whoever was in charge of writing Superstar Season 2. They just wrote plots that make sense and feel proportionate to what we understand about the characters. It's that simple. The conflicts actually work, and so the TV show is good. Plus, thank God we got 2 full seasons to introduce these 9 characters. Everyone got their spotlight episode, everyone feels fully realized, at least, you know, to the fullest Love Live extent. Everyone comment to tell me who your best girl is. If you don't know, here's a cheat sheet. Without divulging too much, early 2022 was a pretty rough time. The first half of the year is honestly a blur. I can't remember most of what I was doing aside from feeling sad. I remember spending one morning flipping through different anime recommendations, podcasts, YouTube videos, all of it failing to even distract me, much less entertain me. I fleetingly started to wonder if I'd lost the capacity to enjoy media at all. And then I watched the first few episodes of Spy Family and I was like, oh, no, I'm good. We're good, actually. And you can quote me on that. Spy Family, not as effective as antidepressants, but it'll do in a pinch. This series is a delight. A spy, an assassin, and a telepath come together and disguise themselves as a family, all in pursuit of their own individual goals, while trying to keep their secret identities a secret from one another. Shenanigans ensue. It's silly and sweet and wholesome, but never too wholesome. It reminds me of Yotsuba. They're both cute, kid-centered, found family stories with just the right amount of edge. If you haven't seen Spy Family, the holidays are a great time for it. It's one of those anime you can absolutely put on around your normie friends and family without offending their sensibilities. Nothing too weird or perverse lurks around the corners. Just a fun premise brought to life by very funny characters. I'm recording this section of the video last. I put off writing it for as long as possible because at this moment, the first core of Mobile Suit Gundam, The Witch from Mercury, isn't finished, and I don't expect them to fumble the ending, but I wanted to absorb as much of the show as possible. The funniest thing I can observe about this anime is the fact that it premiered and my Twitter feed was just flooded with the observation that the writer also did the Utena light novels. And it's true. Ichiro Okochi did produce the 1998 light novel adaptation for Revolutionary Girl Utena. He also wrote Code Geass and Skate, so, I mean, it's like the queer weeb equivalent of calling Taika Waititi the guy who did Thor Ragnarok. I'm sorry, Ichiro Okochi. Utena fans, we can't help ourselves. We have a tiny monkey in our skulls gnawing on our brainstem every time we see a rose or a sword or a car or two girls lying down like this. To be fair, there's good reason to compare this anime to Utena, several allusions that seem very deliberate, and a lot of stuff that just feels Utena-ish. Which was exciting, but I was even more excited to find that beyond the surface comparisons, Gundam Witch is entirely its own entity. A fully unique story with its own point of view, vibrant ideas, and interesting politics all its own. The characters are super charming. Suletta, in particular, is such a fun combination of a plucky, earnest protagonist who also has some hardcore anxiety. And there is brutal drama brewing below the surface that I'm so excited to see culminate. Absolutely watch this one if you're interested. Gundam series are standalone, so you don't need experience with the franchise to understand it. I certainly am not a Gundam head myself, but my Gundam head friends are really enjoying it too, so it's a great experience all around. And here's everything else I loved in 2022. Uncharacteristically for me, I didn't read many comics this year, but I do have a couple new webcomic recommendations. The Golden Boar is the latest comic by Magnolia Porter Siddell, who's been a favorite of mine since I was in high school. She has this wonderfully expressive art style with beautiful colors, but the best thing about her work has to be the characters. They are vivid and funny, but always super grounded, and they tend to follow these arcs that feel very personal, natural, and often unexpected. It's still pretty new, so I don't have much to say about the Golden Boar, but it has some of my favorite stuff. The fantasy world it takes place in feels very rich and well-developed, but it also seems to hinge on a few big ideas, these simple, almost fairy tale-like mechanics that are as metaphorically rich as they are fun story elements. I adore this kind of setting. It's high fantasy made easy for someone like me without an appetite for dense, front-loaded lore. There are fantasy animal people, and the main character is kind of a try-hard narc, which I love in a protagonist. The Golden Boar is free to read, and like I said, it's very new, so now's a great time to hop on board. I'll put a link in the description. This comic actually started in 2021, but it's ongoing, and it deserves a place on this list. What happens next is a comic about... How do I pitch this? I guess it's a crime drama about a trans pastel aesthetic blogger on Tumblr. Or it's a harsh character study of a flawed, chronically online 20-something who is shockingly empathetic despite being a major pill, and also a convicted accomplice to murder. It's dark, it's sad, it's strange and enthralling. It has this classic Tumblr art style that really works for the subject matter. I can't recommend it unless you can stomach very dark stories, but if morally gray characters are your thing, I find this comic totally refreshing and exciting. I've never seen an online person like this depicted so earnestly. Once again, I'm dropping a link in the description, but please be mindful of the content warnings on the first page. Hey, the new Bee and Puppycat rules. Like, I really, really, really love it. Bee and Puppycat has existed for a long time. I loved the pilot back in the day. I pledged to the original Kickstarter a million years ago. But I think by the time the cartoon hangover episodes came out, I was pretty busy with college and didn't really get to appreciate them. The whole series occupied this space in my mind as this simple, silly, twee thing with cutesy art. So when it came to Netflix, I was excited but not expecting much. Not expecting that it would become easily my favorite animated series in the past few years. This show is really special, and I'll attempt to explain why. I love animation, but it's no secret that the West doesn't take animation or its potential very seriously. Most Western cartoons are still for kids, and don't get me wrong, there are some spectacular kids' cartoons, including some of my all-time favorite shows, but it does tend to be written in this obvious, heavy-handed manner that you'd write for a child. Even animation for older audiences often tends to adopt a similar approach. It's all in the relentlessly brisk pacing, the straightforward dialogue, the ever-present swells of music designed to guide your emotions even if you're only half paying attention. There's at least adult animation that gets very weird with the subject matter, if not always with the storytelling techniques, but even that genre has underexplored potential, I think. So imagine how hard I fell for Bee and Puppycat in 2022, a show that has fully embraced its own identity and quirks. Its pacing and rhythm are immaculate. It's slow and soothing to watch, but far too surreal and beautiful and funny to ever get boring. It captures the weirdness and absurdity of adult animation, but it's not an irreverent, episodic comedy written by some dudes in their 30s. It is instead a sprawling magical girl science fantasy story that only reveals the broad reaches of its story in bits and pieces as it spends most of its time absorbed in the day-to-day lives of its charming cast of characters. It's silly and fun, but it takes the emotional core of its story quite seriously, and I can't help but get totally caught up in it. Plus, it has Puppycat. That's my little guy. If you have Netflix and you haven't watched it already, please watch Bee and Puppycat. I've watched the whole thing like 4 times at this point, but I have this sinking feeling we won't get any more, which would be a tragedy. So if you love me, or have ever loved me, or ever plan on loving me in the future, watch some Bee and Puppycat. My best friend finally got me to read the Locked Tomb books this year, and wow, I have to talk about these books. I've been trying to decide how I'd pitch this series, given that its appeal is so hard to summarize. To some extent, I can just say that it's a science fantasy story about lesbian necromancers in space, and some of you will be on board. Taking it a step further, I could mention how much it reminds me of Umineko, Higurashi, and the good parts of Homestuck or Kingdom Hearts, all properties that the author has openly referenced in interviews and beyond, and with that, more of your ears will perk up in interest. But going beyond taglines and references, how do I really pitch this series? The Locked Tomb is a 4-part book series, with the 3rd part coming out just this year, and the 4th yet to be released. It's a story that establishes itself on interesting, vivid characters. In just the first book, you get some freaky twins, a bookish boy genius and his fight girl partner, a charming sickly girl, and these are just secondary characters. The real draw of the book is in the layered love-hate relationship between the protagonist and her childhood enemy. But as the series continues, it sprawls out into this massive story that goes in directions you'd never expect. Each subsequent book in the series goes down a wildly different path from the previous one, and each time I wonder if I'll be as interested in this new angle, and each time I find myself completely absorbed within a few chapters. My enjoyment of the series actually escalated with each book, not because each installment was necessarily better than the last, but because each book builds new layers of intrigue and drama onto what was last established. Each book has its own flavor of unreliable narrator, and they're full of these genius moments where you're able to put the pieces together yourself to grasp something grand about the story. And man, what a story it is. It's beautiful, heartbreaking, and also completely messed up. I love it. And it never loses touch with the core thing that makes the series endearing and digestible, these wonderful characters who you come to love. Plus, the prose is dense and great. This series is written by someone who clearly cares not only about storytelling, but about writing, even if she can't help throwing some memes into the dialogue here and there. There's so much more I could say about The Locked Tomb, like the sheer amount of gender packed into its pages, but I'll leave my pitch here. It's really something you should read and experience for yourself. And that's about it. Media from 2022 that I loved. Thank you for letting me get this out of my system. The next video on the Mystic Messenger series gets my full attention from here, so look forward to it. But in the meantime, let me know in the comments if you also enjoyed any of the stuff I mentioned here. I'd love to know what you guys are enjoying too. Thanks again, and have a wonderful New Year's.